Ever feel totally out of your depth? Like you're in a foreign country and have no clue how things work?
I think we've all had those moments, yeah, like where you just feel that cultural dissonance.
Right, well, that's exactly what happened to Sir Thomas Roe, the first English ambassador to the Mughal Empire way back in the early 1600s. Imagine sailing for months across oceans, only to be basically ignored by the very emperor you came to meet. Talk about a diplomatic nightmare.
Yeah, it's a story that really makes you rethink how empires are built. And luckily, we have a great way to explore all of this Professor Nandini Das's book, Courting India. She uses Roe's own journals and letters and tons of other primary sources.
So we're not just talking about dry historical accounts here. This is a deep dive into the people, the culture clashes, and the political maneuvering that shaped this turning point in history.
Exactly. And to really understand the significance of Roe's mission, we have to set the stage. We're talking about the early 17th century, a time when three huge Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Moguls, and the Safavids, controlled massive territories. They basically dominated global trade.
Okay, quick pause for context. For those of us who maybe don't remember every detail from history class, who were the Safavids and why were they important here?
Good point. They were centered in Persia, what's now Iran. They were a major power in their own right, often clashing with the Ottomans to the west and the Moguls to the east. So England was walking into a very complicated geopolitical situation.
Kind of like showing up at a dinner party where everybody already knows each other and you're trying to figure out who's friends with who.
Exactly. And England at this time was relatively new to the global scene. They were eager to get a share of the profitable trade coming from the east. So they sent Roe to the Mughal court with a very specific mission win over Emperor Jahangir and get an exclusive trade agreement.
But as we said, Roe wasn't just a diplomat. He had his own personal baggage, you could say. He was trying to impress his fancy in-laws back home and also recover some of his own money he'd lost. Talk about pressure.
Absolutely. And his trip to India was anything but smooth sailing. He got sick, he had to deal with cultural misunderstandings, and even ran into an old friend, the pretty eccentric traveler Tom Coriat, right in the middle of India.
That's a whole story in itself. It makes you realize that even back then, the world was more connected than we might think.
Indeed. And speaking of connections, Roe's first meeting with the Mughal court didn't go well at all. He refused to follow their established customs, which caused a diplomatic problem right away.
Some might say he was being culturally insensitive, but Duss suggests he may have been doing this on purpose to make a statement.
That's right. Roe was probably copying the Spanish ambassador to England, Gondomar. He had deliberately caused a stir to get direct access to the English king. So was Roe just out of touch, or was he playing some kind of power game? It's something to think about.
Either way, it didn't exactly make him popular with the Mughal court. And meanwhile, he's trying to get a meeting with Emperor Jahangir, who ruled over an empire way richer and more powerful than England. We're talking 100 times the yearly income. This guy was a big deal.
Yeah, Jahangir was a fascinating guy himself, a scholar, a scientist, and a huge art lover. His diaries are amazing. They give us real insights into his personality and his rule.
But here's the thing. Roe's name never shows up in those diaries. Not even once.
Yeah.
It's like the emperor thought he was completely unimportant.
That's a really telling detail, isn't it? It reminds us that history is often written from the perspective of the winners, the people in power. Doss wants us to dig deeper, to look for the voices that have been silenced or pushed aside.
So we have Roe, this ambitious, kind of arrogant Englishman, trying to make his mark in a world that works by very different rules. Yeah. And we have Jahangir, the powerful Mughal emperor, who doesn't seem bothered at all by this newcomer. You can practically feel the tension building.
And to make things even more complicated, Roe wasn't just dealing with the Mughal court. He was also facing pressure from back home. The East India Company had its own internal rivalries, and they were worried about their merchants going rogue in India, tempted by the wealth and opportunities.
So it's like he's walking a tightrope. He has to keep the East India Company happy, his king happy, and somehow manage this diplomatic mission in a culture he barely understands. No wonder he comes across as stressed and a little judgmental in his writing.
Absolutely. His journals often talk about Indian customs and displays of wealth with this mix of awe and disdain. It's like he's trying to convince himself and maybe his readers back in England that English ways are better, even when faced with the Mughal Empire's obvious splendor.
It's a really interesting psychological dance. It shows the deep-seated anxieties of the time. Europeans were encountering new and different cultures, and it challenged their worldview, their sense of who they were.
And this brings us to a key point that Doss makes Roe's biggest blind spot was Empress Nur Jahan Jahangir's wife. He completely underestimated her influence and how politically savvy she was.
He wrote her off as a meddling stepmother, a jealous woman interfering in affairs of state. He totally missed the fact that she was a powerful figure in her own right.
And that mistake shows how cultural biases can shape how history is interpreted. Roe saw the world through a very specific lens of European patriarchy, and he failed to understand the complexities of Mughal politics.
It makes you wonder how much our own biases shape how we understand the past even today. We'll dig deeper into Nur Jahan's role and what happened with Roe's embassy in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, let's take a moment to think about this clash of cultures, these personalities colliding on the world stage.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Sir Thomas Roe's mission to the Mughal Empire.
We left off with Roe really struggling to navigate a world that just didn't work the way he was used to.
Yeah, and we were just starting to talk about the role of Empress Nur Jahan,
Uh-huh.
a figure Roe definitely underestimated.
He saw her as a jealous stepmother
Yeah.
messing around in politics.
Hmm.
But Das presents a very different picture, right?
Absolutely. Das points out that Nur Jahan had real power. She even issued coins with her own name on them, a first for a Mughal empress.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It really challenges the assumptions Roe had about women and power.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is to consider different perspectives. Roe's account is valuable, but it's only one piece of the story. To really understand, we need to consider the Mughal point of view as well.
So while Roe is trying to play his power games and get this exclusive trade agreement, Nur Jahan is working within a totally different system, one that Roe doesn't even fully get.
Exactly. And this brings us to the core of Roe's mission, that exclusive trade agreement he was so determined to get for the East India Company. How did that work out for him?
Well, you can probably guess it didn't go as planned.
Nope, not at all. Even though we tried really hard, Roe didn't get the big agreement he wanted. The Mughals were tough negotiators. They had no interest in giving one European power control over their trade.
They probably saw right through Roe's attempts to assert English dominance. I mean, they were masters of diplomacy themselves, playing on a much bigger scale.
Exactly. They had their own network of alliances and rivalries to manage. Giving England exclusive rights would have messed up the whole balance of power in the region. Remember, the Portuguese were already established in India, and the Dutch were becoming a major force in the Indian Ocean trade.
So the Mughals weren't just going to let the English call all the shots. They were cleverly using European competition to their advantage.
Right, and that's something Das emphasizes. We often look at this period through a Eurocentric lens, but the Mughals were active players on the world stage.
Meanwhile, Roe is stuck in the middle of all this, becoming more and more frustrated and disillusioned. His journals from this time show a growing sense of isolation and even resentment.
He complains about the corruption of the Mughal court, the endless delays, the elaborate rituals, and the fact that he's not making any progress toward his goals.
It's as if he's losing his grip on the story he'd created for himself, that idea of English superiority. The reality of India just doesn't match up to what he expected.
Yeah, and all this tension comes to a head in what Das calls the Jones affair. One of Roe's servants actually defects to the Mughal court, probably tempted by better pay and maybe a less rigid social system.
Someone actually chose to leave Roe's service for the Mughals. That's a pretty bad look for Roe's leadership.
It definitely undermines his sense of English superiority, and it triggers a wave of anxiety in Roe. He goes on in his journals about the corrupting influence of India on Englishmen, worried that they'll be seduced by Oriental luxury and forget their duty to their king and company.
So it's not just about losing one servant, it's this deeper fear of cultural contamination, the idea that contact with other cultures will somehow weaken English identity.
Yeah, that's a common theme in European travel writing from this period, this underlying anxiety about how different non-European cultures are.
And Roe, despite his education and his experience, is clearly having trouble overcoming these biases.
He's trying to fit the reality of this powerful, sophisticated empire with his preconceived notions of what India should be. And that struggle leads to some pretty interesting contradictions in his writing.
On one hand, he's amazed by the splendor of the Mughal court. On the other, he's constantly trying to distance himself from it, to reassert his feeling of English superiority.
Right, and that brings us to a big question that Das raises. Did Roe's embassy, even with all its failures and biases, actually lay the foundation for later British colonialism?
That's an interesting thought. He may not have achieved his goals, But his writing still shaped how generations of Englishmen saw India.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Roe actually advised the East India Company to stick to peaceful trade, not colonization. He thought building an empire was too expensive and too risky.
So in a way, Roe was pushing for a more practical, even cooperative approach to dealing with India.
Yeah, but no one listened to him. And as we'll see in the last part of our deep dive, Roe himself witnessed things that hinted at the darker side of European ambitions in the East.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Sir Thomas Roe and the Mughal Empire.
We've been following Roe's journey as he tried to get that trade agreement, dealing with those cultural misunderstandings and the political challenges.
Right, and even though he tried really hard, he didn't reach his main goal. But like we've been saying, his experiences and especially his writing had a huge impact on how the English saw India.
His journals and letters became really popular back in England. They shaped people's views for years to come. He gave a firsthand look at this impressive, powerful empire, but he also reinforced those existing biases and fears about how different the East was.
And one of the most vivid things he writes about is seeing Emperor Jahangir's big procession, the Lashkar. It was this big spectacle meant to show off the power and splendor of the Mughal Empire.
Yeah, Roe talks about this seemingly endless line of soldiers, elephants covered in jewels, musicians, dancers, courtiers, even a traveling zoo with lions and leopards. It was a dazzling display of imperial power and wealth.
For our listeners who might not know the term, Lashkar basically means a huge military parade. But for the Mughals, it was way more than just showing off their army. It was a carefully planned performance of imperial authority designed to amaze and intimidate.
Exactly. And Roe, even though he's trying to hold on to that idea of English superiority, he clearly found it impressive.
Yeah.
He goes into detail about the scene, the bright colors, the loud drums, the sheer size of it all. It must have been an incredible experience.
And for Roe, it was so different from anything he'd seen in Europe. He describes it with a mix of awe and, like we've talked about before, a bit of that same disdain.
You get the sense he's trying to downplay how important it all was to cling to that belief in how special England was. But you can't help but think he was secretly impressed, even a little overwhelmed by how magnificent the Mughal Empire was.
It's like he's trying to convince himself that England is still a big player on the world stage, even as he sees firsthand the power and grandeur of another empire.
And that tension, that struggle to match up what he thought with what he's actually seeing runs through all of Roe's writing.
So after all this, the parades, the failed negotiations, the cultural clashes, how does Roe's embassy finally end?
Well, he doesn't get that exclusive trade agreement he'd been pushing for, but he does manage to get some things for the East India Company, like permission to set up a more permanent base in Surat, a big trading port on the west coast of India.
So it wasn't a total failure then?
No, not at all. And in many ways, the most important part of Roe's embassy is his writing, which helped shape how English people saw India for generations.
His account of the Mughal Empire, even with its biases, gave people a glimpse into a world that was both fascinating and kind of scary to Europeans.
And as Das argues, Roe's embassy, even with its limitations, marks a key moment in the shift from trade to empire.
He was there at a time when things were changing, a time when European powers were becoming more and more assertive, and the old ways were starting to fall apart.
And Roe, even though he tried to hold on to the idea that England was superior, he was definitely affected by his time with the Mughal Empire. His story makes us rethink the usual stories about empires and recognize how complicated this period of cultural exchange really was.
It reminds us that history is never simple. It's messy, full of contradictions, and often shaped by things we can't control.
And it challenges us to think critically about what empires left behind, how those cultural encounters have shaped our world, and how important it is to understand different perspectives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Sir Thomas Roe's mission to the Mughal Empire, we have a lot to think about. What if the East India Company had listened to Roe and focused on peaceful trade instead of taking over? Would history have turned out differently?
We'll never know for sure, but it's a question worth considering as we think about the complex and often tragic legacy of empires.
If you found this deep dive interesting, Professor Nandini Das's book, Courting India, is definitely worth a read. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking book that gives us a new understanding of this important time in history. Thanks for joining us.